Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the month of September 2020. Although I hasten to add, filmed in October, as you can tell by the festive background I have in the office this morning. I'm joined as ever by my amazing co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, who isn't quite in the Halloween spirit just yet.
I know it is, as our American colleagues say, spooky season.
Spooky
Uh,
season.
Spooky season, yeah. But I prefer my sort of horror more on the sort of psychological turn of the screw. Don't look now; it all looks natural until it turns horribly weird type. Really.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Well, and yeah, there's room for that. There's a bit of space for that. You could be the Thing, for all we know. Who can say? But
Or our dog could be the Thing, who is sat over on the sofa about
yeah,
3 or 4 meters away from me. So,
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Don't talk about it, or it'll have to absorb you. But anyway,
we're about actually we're about due for a remake, aren't we? Because there was the original
oh,
version in the
oh,
50s, and then
oh,
the
no, no, no,
80s
no,
was.
no, 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 no. They did a prequel sequel a few years ago, which was passable because it leads into the beginning of John Carpenter's The Thing. Obviously, yeah, there is the one based on, was it The Night Watchman or Who Goes There from the 1950s, which really all of it is owed to The Mountains of Madness by Mr. H.P. Lovecraft. So I mean, it's anyway. So but this isn't a spooky movie podcast. This is a ongoing watching brief, and our mission is to discuss the archaeological news of the month and present it here for you to comment on and to add to the conversation that we hopefully begin. And this month's watching brief, we're returning to a theme, certainly in some sections, in terms of how the sector is responding to the ongoing pandemic. But we're going to begin with a couple of things, a couple of little light bits to one to keep an eye on, and one which I just thought was wonderful. So something nice to begin with. But first of all, it's the news that Historic England is satisfied with adequate Stonehenge tunnel investigations. Now, this is something which obviously we've been talking about on and off, or fairly regularly for the past couple of years. The question of whether or not the A303,
Yep.
yeah, 303, is going to be diverted underground near Stonehenge. And what does this headline actually mean, Andy?
It basically means that the planning process is going through as the planning process does.
Mm,
Transport Secretary Grant Shapps is due to make a decision on the A303 dual carriageway and tunnel through the Stonehenge World Heritage Site imminently.
mm,
And as part of that, a new bundle of communications have been added to the mountain of documents that have already been submitted as part of the planning process for this. This is Historic England, who have effectively signed off on the current plan, saying that they believe that the work that's been done to assess the archaeology in the area is, quote, adequate. That doesn't mean it's just, it just about cuts it. It just means that it's adequate to comply with the law.
right.
So therefore, in their view, the process can continue.
I suppose
It's it
I suppose we should be grateful that English Heritage aren't commenting on the economic viability of this plan.
As they did at Bosworth, and which raised a few eyebrows. Although, to be fair, that comment. Actually, it wasn't a publicly available letter. We haven't seen all the correspondence or FOIs within HE about this yet, although
No.
I'm sure we will. Um, if what they release. But I think the other thing, just to put this in context, this is still a very bitterly contested planning application. Whatever the Transport Secretary decides, there'll still be fallout afterwards, and potentially it could be judicially reviewed from both sides
Mm,
if he gives the go ahead or if he says no.
mm,
I think it's also worth quoting there's an article in the New Civil Engineer which actually goes into this and brings it up to date, which also quotes a submission as part of the same process from the opponents of the A303 plan,
Hmm.
uh, which includes the Council for British Archaeology and the Blick Knee Project, which we've talked about before on Watching Brief.
Yep.
They include a paper written by the University of Birmingham's Paul Garwood and also University of Bradford's Professor Vince Gaffney, who's one of the leading landscape and remote sensing sort of academics in British archaeology, really. And they claim that Historic England has, Highways England, get this right, Highways England has, quote, insufficient baseline knowledge and understanding of the heritage of evidence to make sound reasoned judgments. And they add, in short, they, Highways England, do not know what is there, have little understanding of the features and deposits revealed during the evaluation process, and thus have little idea how best to investigate or record the archaeological features and deposits that will be destroyed in the course of the proposed roadworks, which is about as hard ball as you can get in the circumstances. So, as I said, this one's going to run.
And it's interesting that yeah, civil engineers are pointing this out, as opposed to other archaeologically affiliated groups, perhaps, maybe, who might point this out in
Or
similar
even
ways.
or even archaeological magazines, even, yes.
Yeah. But anyway, we'll leave that there. As you say, we will return to this at
We
some
will
point.
certainly leave that one there.
Yeah. um,
Our viewer can speculate to their heart's content. I'm not saying anything.
Stumm. However, we have also, to balance out that fairly serious and slightly cynical tone, we have the story that two rare ladies' loos in Northumberland and Sunderland have been given Grade 2 listed status. And before someone goes, "Oh, unbelievable, they'll list anything these days," actually, these toilets are wonderful. They are, um, uh, let's see, they are in Berwick and on Seaburn seafront in Sunderland, and they've been singled out as an early example of conveniences which catered for women, giving them greater social freedom. This is a little bit of social history here, a little bit of women's history. And the Bank Hill Berwick Loo, which opened in 1899, was disguised as a half-timbered cottage, while the Seaburn convenience, which dates from 1901 to 1904, is discreetly sited underground. The Berwick convenience is in the form of a rustic property to protect the modesty of Berwick ladies, said Myra Toland Smith, a senior North listing advisor for Historic England. And the Berwick and Seaburn loos are rare examples of early lavatories for women, and they reflect the social status of women and the mindset of those times at the turn of the last century. It's funny how so there's an interesting loo in Newcastle as well. There was one in a fairly infamous place called the Big Market. It's the place where everyone turns up and drinks extraordinary amounts of alcohol, to the extent that they just don't feel the cold in the winter. Um, whenever you see a national news story about alcoholism, they come to the Big Market more or less, normally in Newcastle. But actually at the bottom of the Big Market, there's this sort of circular underground loo, which I always found really interesting. I and it sounds so bad, but I think an archaeologist can say this legitimately. I would often just go down there to look at it. And yes,
I was wondering how quickly this item was going to go in this direction. But anyway, carry on.
no, but I would. It,
Dig your hole.
it was it was magnificent. The urinals were brilliant. The stalls were superb. The design of the thing was actually quite nice, and also quite discreet. It had like an iron wrought fence around it. You'd go down a spiral to get into it. And obviously, I can't comment on ladies' loos or indeed these particular ladies' loos, but sometimes public conveniences are a fantastic record of the time. You know that they tell you something about what society was prioritizing and in what way they were catering for the citizens of the time as well. I mean, famously, or well, it should be famous at least. Victorian civil engineering when it comes to, say, pump houses for sewerage systems, this kind of thing. They're almost like wrought iron cathedrals often, because there's a certain pride that people are taking in this sort of stuff. And I think you simply wouldn't get, looking at this, for example, the photo I think of the Loo in Berwick, you simply wouldn't get this sort of attention. It's a tiled roof. It's got this sort of mock Tudor sort of exterior to it. It's a beautiful little building. It could be a playhouse, frankly. It's so quaint. You just wouldn't get that sort of attention for a toilet now. It just wouldn't happen. I mean, I think there wasn't there news from was it in Japan, where there are toilets that are transparent but electronically mist up when you go into them. I'm not sure I'd have the courage to go into one of those myself, but it's just interesting. Sometimes loos are an interesting focus, a foci of foci locus of foci for these sorts of conversations about how people are seen and how people see themselves as well. Actually,
Absolutely. And first of all, I think it's brilliant that Historic England and other equivalent bodies are listing buildings like this, because they are part of our landscape. They are part of our social history.
mm,
Those ones in particular, they date from a period when the provision of that kind of facility for the public, for the free or very cheap use of the
mm,
public, was seen as a civic good, and it's something that is now almost unknown.
mm.
Um, and as anybody, for example, who's had young children and tried to find a private place to change a nappy or something, until relatively recently, stores and so on didn't provide that kind of facility, and there was a gap between the sort of late 70s and 80s when public buildings like that went out of use because of basically cuts to local government funding,
Mm.
um, and the private provision of facilities like that for people who are out and about. And so yeah, that in itself is great. Obviously the point about architecture and civic architecture again is well made. I live just down the road from the Bazalgette pumping stations at Crossness
Mm.
on the Great London Intercept sewer,
Mm.
which, as you say, they're Puginesque in
Mm.
their lavishness. They're wonderful buildings,
Yeah.
in the process of being restored. So yeah, it's really important we do um, we do recognise where that these buildings are important and need to be remembered and need to be preserved in certain cases.
Mm. It's funny because I mean, Pugin was an architect whose life's work was driven by a conviction of the honesty of architecture. He was
Mm,
he was affronted by Georgian frippery and falsity on the fronts of buildings, this kind of thing. Um,
yeah.
but in that sense, I mean, I think it's the right word, in so much as these are buildings that were built with a certain conviction, and also with the notion that um, in a way which is also echoed in the ancient Roman world, that wealthy people kind of had a civic duty to provide, and in providing it, I mean, they got a benefit. It often up to their political status, or they could point to it as a measure of how it is that their city or their civilization was better than others, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't completely philanthropic, but it's interesting how
Oh no, absolutely! It's absolutely to do with class as well.
yeah.
A couple of very quick points I'll make on this, and I know we're only on the preliminary here, but before we get into the meat of the show, but just a couple of things. First of all, I used to work in theatre, and I worked at theatre in the West End,
Mm,
and certainly our theatre, the Old Astoria, had what we called the Royal Loo, which was kept clean but locked, and it was there for the exclusive use of VIPs, including, if we ever had a visit from Her Majesty.
very important
Um,
P.
Absolutely. If a very important person needed a very important P, they had a facility that was exclusively theirs.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but also contemporary with some of these buildings that are now being preserved. The 1920s mansion that I'm a trustee of, it's Grade 2 listed, um, one of the reasons it's listed is the interior survives very well, and part of the interior that has survived is um, the high end bathroom that was associated with for the master and mistress of the house
Hmm.
and important visitors, which is it's beautifully finished and tiled and so on, but it has surviving a brass push button. It was electric. It was state of the art at the time, but it has an electric call bell.
Okay.
That if you're in your bath and you want your warm towel brought to you by your servant,
Or a
or
gin.
another glass of or another gin and
Hmm.
tonic, or another glass of champagne, you can press the call button.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Mod
and we show that
cons.
to visitors. Absolutely, and we show
Hmm.
that to visitors, and you say, look, this is what was expected of a high-end building at that time. You were expecting to have servants to wait on you,
Yeah.
even doing the most basic functions of a human being.
Hmm. And well, and in that sense, I think just to finish uh, where I was going, I think as I say, it wasn't pure philanthropy. There definitely was a benefit to it, but also at the same time, one wonders what's the equivalent today. And it's funny because just before we started recording, we mentioned or we were discussing briefly figures like Bill Gates, for example, using their immense wealth to set up foundations to combat water poverty or, you know, um, um, things like pandemics, etc. Uh, and it maybe that's because sometimes I feel a little bit cynical. I sort of go, oh well, now these days, very wealthy people simply aren't exposed to the poverty that surrounds them. So here in the northeast, there was a local arms manufacturer and engineer, Lord Armstrong,
Yeah.
who actually was wonderful for people in the area. I think we've talked about this in the past, and this is slightly rambling now, but I think this is a good little segment that we put together. I think, in so much as he lived up in the sticks of Northumberland, but would have to obviously get horse and carriage down to town or to Toon when he wanted to visit the docks or go to his offices, and therefore actually he saw. The effect that his employment had on local people, but also
Mm.
actually he saw the needs of local people, and that led to things like peppercorn rents, the invention of the Tyneside flat that gave people the dignity of living in a house, even when they only really occupied one floor of that building. It looked as though they were living on a terraced house street, and other little bits and bobs that make him absolutely, uh, you know. Uh, an aristocrat, in so much as he definitely wasn't a man of the people in that sense. If you go to his house, Craigside, it was in that sense, it was in some ways quite remarkable. It was an early example of electrification in a building.
Well, he
Um,
has his own hydroelectric power station,
he
doesn't he?
did, yeah,
If
yeah.
I remember rightly.
He installed electrified dumb waiters for staff. He invested in things like I think a vacuum technology as well to make again easier for his staff to clean. But again, there came with a certain kudos with that because when his friends, or when even, for example, the Queen came to stay, Queen Victoria, I think, once came to stay at the house, and he actually built a whole new wing for her to stay in. Um, he could point at that and go, "Look at this amazing technology that we have in the house," blah blah blah. So okay, it comes with kudos, but also
And give me another arms contract, Mom.
yeah, exactly, yes, precisely, yes, for the empire. Um, but crucially, he couldn't ignore um, the poverty that surrounded him. And sometimes I think that sometimes it's very easy, to have a big car with tinted glass, or to have a private jet or a helicopter, and just not see how real people are living these days. So it's an example
Well,
like a public. It's like,
mm. No, I was going to say absolute case in point, and we're going to talk about the gentleman later. But where you have the leader of the free world rejoicing in the fact that they're smart because they paid no tax, or as we discovered, $750
mm,
in income taxes.
yeah.
That there's no sense of social responsibility there, which is what taxation was meant to be about.
Social
So
responsibility, but also I think it's possible to take pride in that. I don't think it should be seen as a punishment in that sense. Um,
yeah.
and yeah, and so as I say, when you see people like Lord Armstrong, or when you see, coming all the way back to the point of this article, when you see or this segment, when you see articles about early public conveniences for women, you're sort of
Mm.
reminded of that, a time when people were a little bit more, um, felt a little bit more beholden to their neighbours, no matter their status, as it were, in some way. Again, I'm not saying it was a perfect world by any means, but it's an interesting demonstration of how people with wealth felt were uh, they were obliged to funnel their money in certain directions.
Absolutely, and also the other thing I'm reminded of particularly are the campaigns, for example, is in our borough here, which is very diverse and has areas of real deprivation,
Mm,
um, and it's campaigns about things that really shouldn't have to be campaigned about, which is like period poverty for young girls.
mm, yeah.
It is those are the kind of things that were seen as a scandal, and a good person, and particularly a rich good person in the Victorian period, would try to allay if they had the means to do so.
Mm,
And then eventually, the state decided that through local authorities that they would provide those kind of facilities.
mm,
And we wonder where we go in future on really basic provisions like this.
yeah. Yeah. Anyway, as the preamble goes, that was quite lengthy, but hopefully it was also quite fun.